Greetings all. Welcome to our live stream. This is our first of a series of three that we have planned tied to looking primarily at circular supply chains. And I am blessed once again to have Zsofia at my side. Zsofia, thank you very much for joining me today. And you will be the star of our live stream. The subject is going to be tied to some things that you've put together recently, looking at the subjects, and the title is Frugal Supply Chain. So perhaps maybe to get us started, if you can go ahead and describe to us exactly what a frugal supply chain is all about.
Absolutely, and thank you for having me here, Mike, again, and hello, everybody, again. Basically, first of all, the reason why I put this material together is that, the amount of material out there on circular economy and circular businesses, sustainability is really increasing. And from a supply chain perspective, I just wanted to boil it down to a very simple methodology and not trying to reinvent the wheel, but going back to some of the roots that we should remember in supply chain and relearn those skills that we really need to use. So for me, a frugal supply chain as a concept is merely to use all the methodologies and the models that we have already available for us as professionals with a different mindset. And what does that different mindset really mean is to look for, that social, ecological, and economical value at the same time. So whenever we evaluate how we work together and what kind of value we are creating in the business and within supply chain, that means that we are balancing these three elements and we do not let us, take a shortcut and compromise on any of these elements. And that requires as you said so many times, and I love our discussions on this, frugal mindset and frugal innovation. So we need to have everyone working in our supply chain to feel empowered to come up with ideas that might, sound a little bit crazy first, but then taking a closer look, it really is a solution because it's different than what we did before, concentrating on ourselves all the time. And now we take a look at, how we operate within our network and what is really that joint value and how we can reach that, right? And I know this sounds super simple, first glance, right, from a helicopter view, but I'm sure we can discuss with the audience how hard it is really to reach this kind of way of working and mindset in any of the supply chains. It's not easy.
No, it's not. And that was a clear call to action to all of you out there to go ahead and ask us questions because we're interested in having a dialogue between all of us. This is not supposed to be asynchronous. We're trying to come up with a synchronous experience. And of course, this is an opportunity for you to go ahead and challenge us. And I really enjoy that sort of thing. And speaking of challenges, I'd like to go ahead and start with one question that immediately came to mind when I was going through all of your material. If we look at the difference, say, for example, between business process management and supply chain management, you might differ on this definition. But for me, the business process management is what's taking place within the company. And the supply chain, of course, is dealing with all of the various parts within the supply chain. I got the impression that with a lot of the things I was reading from you, that the focus was more internal than anything else. And I'd be curious to find out if my assumption was correct, and secondly, why did you take this approach?
Yeah, for a first glance, it seems to be, internally focused. But for me, the reason why I think this internal focus needs to take place is because we need to really change our own mindset. So for me, that's where everything starts, right? So I think we can come up with, glamorous concepts. We can reinvent the wheel and come up with new methodologies, new terminology, you name it. We can even issue another business book, right, or supply chain book that has never been written. But essentially, it boils down to how I behave as a professional every day and whether I'm able to, first of all, look for those social and ecological values next to the economical values that are so used to look for, right? So And that takes time, and then really it starts with us. And same as in our own private life, I would say we cannot just say, oh, as a professional, I'm required to, reach a year-on-year 5% cut on the cost if I'm in sourcing. We need to stand up as professionals and say, look, this is just wrong. We are exploiting our supplier. I don't say that's the case all the time, but for instance, having a KPI in someone's job profile like this is also something that I would say needs to change in the future. And that starts with also us thinking differently. And of course, it needs to start with the leadership of the company, but taking that inward looking kind of taking that inventory of how we are as human beings and whether we have that knowledge and capability to change is the first step to change. And of course, the evaluation itself goes way out. So that was my way of thinking or my approach.
Mm-hmm. This is what I understood from what you were saying. And please, maybe if you can validate if I got it right. First of all, the first point, the first takeaway was if we can't get it right internally, how are we supposed to get it right externally? That would be number one.
Correct.
And you talked a lot about, I'm going to call them values.
Yes.
What we stand for. And in fact, if you're not capable as an organization to say that these are the things that we truly stand for, and to ensure that all of the employees within the organization, that you have their buy-in, then if you're not able to do that, how are you supposed to spread that word out to others? It's not possible, right?
Exactly, Mike. You hit the nail on the head, really.
Okay.
That I wouldn't even put anything else to that. But really, for me, when I hear all of these concepts, and it starts with how you evaluate your partner. That's how we go into kind of relationships, right? That's used to be the way of thinking, and also when you approach a sourcing relationship or even a partnership with customers within supply chain, then it's always about, okay, so what can I expect from the other party? And that was the mindset, right? Or how can I make sure that my half of that apple is not rotten? And then we just forget that if the other side is rotten, our side will get rotten as well, right? So make no mistake.
Well, certainly, again, we're talking about standards that we set for ourselves. And if we are not capable of setting those standards for ourselves, well, then how can we actually expect any of our partners to go ahead and adhere to them? And that's really the issue. There was another point that I thought was very interesting in that of what you were writing, and it was all tied to, I'm going to call it collective responsibility. That was not necessarily the words that you used, but that was kind of my interpretation, because one of the biggest problems we have within a supply chain, or basically how we do business in general, that we'll have one individual or a group who's responsible for A, and then we have somebody responsible for B, and then we continue down the chain, so that by nature it becomes disjointed because we've broken it down out of efficiency. Yes. And we forget exactly what the general or what the overall goal is. And that was very clear to me in your documentation. So if we say that it's a bit disjointed and we don't have the sustainable goal in mind, what would be your suggestions on how we bring that together, assuming that we have our act together internally?
Yeah, assuming that we have or got our act together internally, then I would say the next step is really, we can go back to those values and that code of conduct as an individual and as a professional. Of course, I could say, if someone does not adhere to, our new standards, then we could sever those ties or just leave that partner. But I would say the right thing to do is really to evaluate if that partnership is valuable for both sides, right? I think we kind of mentioned also that angle earlier, and I'm going to be a little bit provocative here with all the supply chain professionals to see, are we really digging deep enough to see if my partner is benefiting from what I'm asking them to do? I specifically think here about, lands that are far away that we are sourcing from. So yeah, nice enough to have cashews here in Europe all year around, right, in a huge amount, or get, precious metals from Africa, because we need it, right? So it must be beneficial for the other party as well on the long term. But did we really think about this when we put together the product or the design, right? So these are those questions where we really need to start digging. And then that's where the hardship or the toughness of this exercise starts, for everybody, because it also challenges our own internal, maybe subconscious bias, because we don't even realize how self-centered we might be, right? Not just from a business perspective, but this is what we were taught earlier. So
it reminds me another question, especially what we talk about tied to the Millennium Goals. But I'd like to go ahead and address one of the questions that came from our audience. This would be from Anna. How can we as customers avoid getting tricked into buying sustainable products, even though these products are only sustainable to a certain degree? I'm assuming when we say sustainable to a certain degree, we're talking about different definitions.
Absolutely, and that certain degree can be a very little or even greenwashing, as we usually discuss, or can be really also an effort, a real effort from the company. They just haven't got there yet, right? So I would say as a private individual, I can only recommend what I'm doing, which is really, first and foremost, we use the circular economy principles, right? So reduce your consumption and then reuse and then recycle and upcycle what you are using. So ideally, if I take a look at the product before buying it, I really think, and I'm using this myself, and by all means, I'm not perfect. So I also fall victim of some of the not so sustainable situations, but then we learn from it. But anyway, back to the question, really. So I look at it and I really do my due diligence. I look up the company, I look up what they are doing. And, if you don't find information on the company website that speaks directly about, the process itself, and then how they operate. So those companies who are really sustainably operating, they are not kind of unhappy to share the details. So they are sharing a lot of information directly with the customers, and not necessarily to trick them, but really because they have nothing to hide. So there you can see the process of how they operate, who they work with, what kind of suppliers or partners they are using. And I'm specifically changing supplier to partner in the terminology, because I think it's also changing the dialogue, how we think about those people that we work with and companies we work with. So I look for all of these signs, and I actually don't look for the SDGs or the ESGs as targets displayed on the website, because that's just, PR, or for me, that's something that they put out there. Of course, someone can be certified, but I really look for the process, sharing how much detail they share of the process, what kind of components they are using, if it's a service, then how they really go about engaging the partners, and what kind of different concepts they are using in the contracts. For instance, I have seen companies who are willing to share contractual details with their partners. That's how transparent they are. So if you look for these details, you can go wrong, but it gets better. And after some time, I think, Mike, we can agree on that we also had our fair share of search for these companies, and in the end, day by day, you will get better, and you will spot, those nuances that will tell you this is the red flag, this is not the real deal. That's all I can say. Sorry, I'm not more, knowledgeable as a private individual either.
Yeah, I think there are a couple things that I'd like to piggyback on this
Please.
question. And again, thanks for the question, Anna. One of them is, and this is something we talk about in our class. So these companies might have a different definition of the word sustainable than I do.
Exactly.
And so the real question is, so what are we basing this conversation on? If they go ahead and talk about it and it doesn't really meet my standards, then it makes it very easy to go ahead and check them off the list. But I think it's much more complicated than that, because we expect a certain expertise from the populace that is actually buying these products, which takes a lot of time, and they might not necessarily be privy to this information that we've been talking about. It is very time consuming. I know that you're aware of that all too well, Zsofia, and I think that those of you out there in the audience that are trying to live sustainably, and the word I love using is hoodwinked. You feel like you've been hoodwinked. You bought a you bought a bill of goods, and it leaves a very bitter taste in your mouth afterwards because you wanted to do something right. You thought you were doing something right, and then it's gotcha. And the the real question is, how do we go ahead and drive this down to the various players within the supply chain that this is what we need. We have the values. We understand that we need to get our internal processes together, but there's one more component. Unfortunately, we received a very bad notice last week. The CEO of Danone got fired.
Yes.
And that was considered to be one of the few real sustainable companies out there. And the reason why is because the foreign stakeholders thought that they were not going ahead and delivering shareholder value. So now the real question is, you talked about ESG earlier. How do we go ahead and get the financial people on board? Because if we don't do that, I think that we're going to struggle with getting these sustainable supply chains up and running.
Absolutely, and then you couldn't be more right here, Mike. What I can say here is the good example that I've seen myself already. And that's why I brought in, the total value model instead of kind of total cost model into the discussion when I put together the documents. Because for me, it can happen, that, and that's the general perception, by the way, from the finance community, that as soon as you start doing something sustainably or in a circular way, then it immediately goes through the roof in terms of costs, right? Because you're gonna go for premium stuff, high quality, low volume, and etc. But in reality, that's really about the frugal innovation and the frugal supply chain side. That you need to find those elements that were not cost efficient before. So, for instance, it's okay to source something from China, right, for a fraction of the price, and that's the only measure that the finance community knew. But at the same time, they never looked into the other components, right? So all of these measurement element and reporting KPIs, and that's why I really don't recommend anyone to look at those on any of the websites. We need to correct those. We need to correct those 100%, and this is still ahead of us as a global community. Let it be Europe, US, whatever. We need to amend them and make sure that, for instance, in a case like this, then all the CO2 and other not sustainable elements of that supply chain, looking at sourcing anything from China, for instance, stacks up properly, right? So look at really the total value delivered, including how much does it cost to get it here, but not just get it here, but what are those social and ecological implications along the lines? And oh yeah, maybe that PET bottle or the others from China will not be that cheap any longer, right? So sourcing it from closer in a different way, from a different material, will be actually cheaper for the company, right? So I would say, as long as we don't have that shared understanding of what sustainability and circularity means, and I think we need to educate the whole business community on this, then it will be a long road ahead. And I'm sure it will be a long road, but we need to get there. So
I think when we start talking about total cost, the real question is cost for whom? Because we have this idea that if you go ahead and buy the resources, first of all, they belong to you. Secondly, you can do whatever you want. And what happens afterwards is none of your concern. And we've seen this movie way too many times.
Exactly.
And then the real question, getting back to because I think this is really important, what you're talking about tied to total cost. And if we're able to go ahead and say that all of this, that what's been created over the years, that we have been paying the price for all of this. And of course, global warming is only one part of this equation. If everybody was to understand the total cost, then the real question is, how do we go ahead and ensure that the rules are changed upstream, that when the resources are actually purchased, that we add additional responsibilities within that purchase to ensure that we are not left holding the bag? What are your thoughts on that one?
First of all, I can only agree with you on that point. And secondly, it really is, the case that we just don't think about, even I can go back this economical side of the ecological and societal impact, right? Nobody ever thinks about how much does it cost us that people cannot go to work because the weather is changing every second day from plus 20 degrees to minus 5, for instance, in the last 2 or 3 weeks, right? How many people have signed off with migraine or any other, health issues? And that nobody really puts into the equation, just like you said, or the other elements of the overpolluted ocean or rivers or anything, right? So, yeah, sure, we don't see the microplastic in the fish that we buy, but we are so healthy. So yeah, we need to start with getting that understanding around and getting that into the total equation and placing not just the cost, but the responsibility in the right place. And that's also with the companies, with the individual companies. So for me, it also means that when we think about company level shareholder value delivered, then it has to be again on those three pillars: social pillar, ecological pillar, and the economical pillar. We cannot move on with that economical pillar only. So for me, that's just, if we do that, we're going to die out earlier than the dinos did.
Yeah, I wish we can treat that as being a joke, but unfortunately, it's too close to the
Yeah,
truth.
exactly.
Yeah, it's tied to a lot of the exercises that I've been performing lately, and that would be directly tied to establishing or constructing a material flow analysis, understanding where the resources are coming from, understanding that we need to have an end-to-end picture, which of course for me depicts the supply chain being part of that for sure.
Yes.
The one of the biggest problems that I run across, and give you an example from yesterday. Yesterday was World Recycling Day. For those of you who aren't in the know, that yesterday was World Recycling Day, and I was out here in Vienna in the Danube Islands helping people to go ahead and pick up the trash, not because we are such great good Samaritans, but rather to show exactly what kind of damage is being done more from a PR perspective. And there was somebody from a local radio station, and I was introduced and said, "Oh, he's coming from the circular economy," and this person had difficulties in equating circular economy and what we were doing picking up waste, which shows me that we are so fixated on end of pipe, what comes out at the end, not understanding what happens upstream, which is really a key. So how do we go ahead and introduce this concept into companies? Because I know that that's really your focus. What would be, if I was coming to you with a case study like that, and the company's concentrating primarily on end of pipe, like so many others, what approach would you take to get started in trying to show the company the error of their ways?
Well, normally what I normally do is really going through my own approach based on what they are doing. Of course, I'm using assumptions as well, but they can correct that along the way when we discuss, the differences, and really show them where they are in their own overall footprint, from a sociological, ecological, and economical perspective, and then really, point out those elements in their process that can be done very differently, which could add to the economical side, but at the same time still make sure that the social and ecological impact is positive, right? So for me, that's the process. Of course, I can, when I get a chance and go in for a detailed analysis, then it can go from really applying normal supply chain methodologies and showing them how it's done differently. So showing the mindset difference, right? So I put these two things parallel next to each other and show them really where the difference in the value are. That's the only way I can see at the moment. I hope
Mm-hmm.
others have other ways. Maybe it's also a call for action. I'm ready to learn as well from
Sure.
others, I hope.
Mm-hmm.
So, these are, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I
Sorry.
was going to say that is a clear call to all of you out there. If you would like to go ahead and raise questions to us, and I think it would be good to challenge maybe some of the things that we're talking about. My personal
Absolutely.
take on this one is that if they do not see the need to change, in other words, if they are not forced to change, they will not change.
That's very true, Mike.
Understanding that change does not take place here; it takes place in the solar plexus, and I believe that we all have responsibility, and that we're all empowered in some fashion. And so, in this ideal world, we would go ahead and foster that empowerment within those people that really want to make a difference, and hold these companies accountable. And I think once you start doing that, you have a chance of actually going ahead and making a change. There was
Absolutely.
one of our conversations that we had prior to this live stream was tied to the Millennium Goals. And for those of you who are not familiar with the Millennium Goals, I mean, there were a few years ago. Enough people still don't know what the Sustainable Development Goals are about. But the Millennium Goals was our first attempt. And please, if I got the dates wrong, you can correct me on this one, Sophie. But I think we started around the year 2000. And the
Yes.
idea was to reduce poverty by a certain amount, and we were mega
Mhm.
successful.
Mhm.
But there are certain things that we don't talk about and tied to the Millennium Goals that I think that we need to take the mask off. So maybe if you can kind of talk about how those millennial goals were actually reached, and especially tied to the supply chain from your perspective.
Absolutely. And I honestly can thank you for this question, because this is one of those painful areas that not many people are willing to talk about. Because essentially, those millennial goals, like literally eradicating poverty and etc., were reached via our really, I would say, not even subconsciously, but openly biased view of what does that mean for us Westerner societies. And we just exploited, the Asian markets and Africa in that process. And by all means, we also try to, from a supply chain perspective, to really stick to the point that you just made. For me, to think that I need to, support a community so far away from me by me ordering something that they never need otherwise in their own lives. And that's how I'm going to support them, right? To get better off. Maybe they don't even need to be better off, because they were happy as they were before I went there, right? So that kind of really self-centered perception around what wealth means, and trying to force other nations and other indigenous communities, for instance, also in other parts of the globe, to copy what we think as wealthy and healthy and everything. It destroys that environment, right? So I know it's provocative for many people to think about, but please try to take on a lens that they have. So I strongly believe that if we leave some of the African communities to come up with their own solutions for themselves, what they really need, they will thrive. We don't need, all of these extra donations that we are sending there, that ends up in somewhere that we don't even know where it ends. But apparently in the last 20 years they didn't develop anywhere, because we try to force them to do something that they don't need. So again, global supply chains, we need to take a really hard look at ourselves and think about, okay, yes, I was asking for precious metals from Africa. I was asking, or used to ask for, exotic things from Asia, or even ask them to, produce absolutely ridiculous amount of chips or whatever that I think I need for my own technological development, right? But they would never use it in their own lives. So why can't we find a solution that is here? If I need that, then I need to find the source here, right? And I need to make sure that they thrive in their own way and not by the measures and the means that I deem appropriate for my life. That's essentially for me, direct conflict between, the perception of freedom and wealth. For I think wealth is really freedom, and then this is also how we define it in the Western societies, right, Mike? We are so amped up about freedom, and then all we do is kind of restrict others to give us our freedom, right? And that's not freedom. So we need to get back to that evaluation.
I thought it was quite poignant. There was a live stream that we did last year, and we had a representative from Sustainable Cocoa. And I thought I was going to be clever in asking a question. So, how many of those individuals that actually go ahead and pick the cocoa beans, how many of them actually get a chance to participate in the spoils, that being the chocolate at the end? And the response I got, I was not ready for. And it really left an impression. And what Lily said was, they don't even know what we're using it for. So let's go back to your example. Let's go back to your example when we're talking about things being produced to cover our needs, which obviously in this example, if they don't even know what it's being used for, it certainly doesn't meet their needs, does it? Exactly. And so the real question, in my personal take on this one, is that we saw in the beginning of the pandemic that when the supply chains went phooey, that we had a number of touch points in the global south that were massively affected, much more than we were, simply because they had no way of actually going ahead and transporting these goods to us. And of course, you would say it wouldn't make any difference, but they have no need themselves for those things that are being produced. So we were able to actually go ahead and see the magnitude of the problem per se. And for me personally, if that wasn't a wake-up call, then I don't know what it was. And if we're talking about closed loops, which leads me to another question. I got another question.
Yes.
I'm very appreciative. If we're talking about closed loop and we're talking about circular supply chains, then obviously this model, from all of your definitions, from a societal perspective, from an ecological perspective, and let's be honest, nobody can tell us that on the long term that this is economically prosperous. If we consider that the only way we're going to go ahead and make these happen, if we are able to go ahead and exploit those resources on the other side. And that's really the elephant in the room. Okay, and then I'll put that one on pause. Let's go ahead and get to this question. Eamon is asking, so can maybe if we give an example of a circular supply chain? Maybe perhaps you'd like to go ahead and approach that one?
Yeah, absolutely. For me, this is a very generic question. And in general, I can give a generic answer to it if hopefully that helps him. And so for me, if you think about a circular supply chain, then it means that whatever the company is doing, whatever they take is coming from a renewable resource. And then how they make the product or the service, how they deliver the service, is also delivering value for the society. So it's something that they need, right, locally or in that community that they are targeting to sell the product to. It does not harm the environment in the process during the production. So they are able to utilize every piece that they procure for that process. They are able to utilize, and if they are not utilizing it, they are able to either reuse or recycle or upcycle to someone else in the network, which needs to be built up, right, for most of the supply chains. That kind of element is still something that not many companies touched. There are a few good examples, but not many. And in that sense, of course, in the process, as you said, Mike, I leave that up to further questions. Hopefully others will challenge as well. We need to find, procedural efficiency in a way that in doing these steps, we agree to that and arrive to that agreed value. So we also need to revisit what is value, what do we mean by creating value for the company economically, right? And if all of these elements are met in that process, and then the product being used on the market by the customers is really providing that social and ecological and economical value, then it will be used for a long time, right? Or over a long period of time. And after use, it can be either completely dismantled and released to the environment, and it will be absorbed by the environment, or can be recycled and reused in another process. But end of life, really full end of life means that it can be really reabsorbed by the environment.
Mm-hmm.
Is it easy? No, it's completely not easy. Can I give you, ample examples from companies who are doing this really well? No, quite frankly, no. What I can give you, and really honest evaluation of what digging I have done so far into different companies, also those who came up with a circular design already, right? They really are good at trying to make their own processes circular, but many of them struggle on the distribution and the partnership element. That's my general observation. How we can solve it is still an open question, and I'm also, examining different procedures and all of the new technologies coming up as a professional. So I can only say that we are in a process, and I cannot give you a really good example, an exact example of who's doing this really well, quite frankly.
Yeah, I think one of the issues that we have quite often, piggybacking on that of what you just said, Zsofia, in being able to manage the internal, but the external becomes difficult, is because there's always a bit of a power play. Who is actually going ahead in managing the supply chain? Is it coming from the suppliers? So in other words, are we talking about goods that are rare and they more or less set the tone? Is it managed maybe lower down on the stream? We have the best example, of course, coming from Amazon, who is managing various points in the chain without actually going ahead and owning it. So it's not the typical vertical supply chain in the way that we always looked at it, but you don't have to own it to control it. And that's really the point. Exactly. And now they've even gotten to the point tied to their logistics systems where everybody has to be part of it. They are controlling the information. And so by controlling the information, you're able to go ahead and manage that. That seems to be one of the biggest struggles. We have a number of questions. I like to make sure that we get to them, but there's one point I would like to go ahead and raise tied to something we said in the beginning, and that was all tied to value and those ideals that we believe in. Now, I think one of the issues that we have, getting back to this idea of a circular supply chain, apart from understanding the complexity or what the objectives are, how do we go ahead and define for ourselves whether this is good enough? And for me, it was a bit of an eye-opener understanding the actual exploitation that we were referring to earlier, and understanding that all of these things that I take for granted are actually on the back of somebody else. And if we can get that message out, and it's not a very pretty message because, of course, that means that we're all sinners, the sooner we can actually get that message out and understanding that the acknowledgement is the first step towards redemption, then we can actually go ahead and start making some corrections. Let me go to one first, starting off with Anna again, and this is something that we've been talking about in the class. We have a couple of projects where they're looking at sustainability tied to fast fashion. And the examples that we've been looking at, and there are a couple, obviously a number of them out there, Primark and H&M. What are your experiences tied to these two brands as to what their message is as far as what they consider sustainability to be? To what degree does that actually mesh with what maybe something that would be truly considered sustainable, or a common definition? And then maybe based upon your experience, where are they dropping the ball? I think that would be quite useful for the students.
Yeah, absolutely. And looking at just the two brand names, I can easily say that well, based on my experience with both of the brands, for instance, if we talk about Primark specifically, and how they operate in general, and where they source their products from is already exploitation. So if I really start with that, then we can easily say they are nowhere near sustainable, right, as a brand. And of course, even if they go in the direction like H&M, that they started, recycling clothes, in store, or send back, or any other option, even those clothes that they are not selling or producing, that's one of those steps that helps reduce, that unconscious pain of being a sinner. But evidently it's just trying to drive customers to spend more with them because they appear to be more sustainable. It's a good marketing. It works for a lot of people, for all the reasons that we discussed with Mike already, simply because of lack of knowledge, or just not paying attention. But inherently, if they really wanted to start being more sustainable and circular, then they need to rethink their whole business model, right? So I would say, and I'm going to be radical here, there is no such thing as sustainable fast fashion. And I think that shows my commitment to the topic and the subject. Fast fashion inherently means that you are over consuming and you are using resources that you do not need. There is no such thing as sustainable or circular fast fashion. I'm sorry. We need to get back to responsible consumption, especially on clothes, because I think all of you who study supply chain with Mike, and then even others in my peer group who signed up for today, we all know, that many of these upstream processes in the clothes production are absolutely mind-blowing on water consumption and everything else. And even if we come up with technologies where they use very little or no water or any other resources, I would like to see, more stringent audit, as you said, Mike, as well earlier. I would like to see more accountability, or somehow, we as consumers can hold them accountable and kind of stop buying from them. But it's also a vicious circle, right? Because if you have, the majority of the population, that's the budget that they can afford, right? So I would say it needs to come also from the government perspective and an overarching global oversight perspective to hold them accountable and push them into the direction of consuming less in the first place, and operate with a different model on top of that.
As much as it was said about Henry Ford, he was at least one of the first ones to go ahead and say, if the people who are building the cars can't afford the cars, there's a problem. And I really question to what degree the people, those individuals, primarily women, who are responsible for actually going ahead and producing this fashion, I ask the open question, how many of them can actually afford it? And I would be highly surprised if the answer is yes, they can. Because I think the answer is no, they can't. Let's go ahead and move on to another question. This is also coming from Anna. If you were in the process of founding your own business, how would be the most important steps to consider to develop a sustainable supply chain?
I love it. I love this question as well. All of them, actually, but this is also amazing. So I think let's just get back to that triangle of societal, ecological, and economical value. And if you come up with a product or a service, then when you go through, in your mind, how you're going to build up your own value chain and the value network with the partners, every time you go through a process step from the early design even, first of all, involving everyone in the process from every different knowledge type, right? So, of course, as a startup, you have 2-3 people, right? So that's a different story. But if you don't have, specific knowledge, I would say, don't even look for consultants. Look for good people with good functional knowledge in circular supply chains. And you can ask for pro bono support, anything really. You don't need to pay for consultancy. Please just, I want to put that out there because startups cannot afford it. But at the same time, make sure that insight that you get in terms of each step on the way, to make sure that you ask the right questions and really those points are being evaluated, and ask the hard questions. Ask those questions every single step on the way. Am I creating value for those who do the process for me? Am I creating value for ourselves as a company? And is that a real value on the customer market or for the customer? And of course, these two, the last two we always ask, right? But also the first one, and to evaluate those processes on the total network level that you plan to use to get that product or service done is a very different way of evaluation. It might come out that you had a good idea, but the first cut of that set of questions would come to an economically not viable solution, right? That's where frugal innovation comes in play. And then you can start asking the question every step on the way. What would I do if I had none of the resources that I envisaged needing for this process? Is there another way? Can I use a different source? And etc. and etc. And if you go through that process, that might actually come up with a final, design for that whole value chain that can give you both social, ecological, and economical value. And of course, it needs to be closed loop, right, as we discussed all along the way. So you need to make sure that the resources you're using are renewable, and at the end of life, it really goes back, and it's not creating, for the trash that we need to accumulate somewhere, as we do at the moment, right?
Back to end of pipe. Thank you for that,
Exactly.
Zsofia. Yeah, we have another question. This is coming from Vansuza Dar. Thanks to the book of Kevin Bales, one of your subjects that you like is ethical ways to procure. And there needs to be a logistical optimization of supply chains. So how do we balance both and being economically to consumer?
It's a really good question. So for me, it starts with that shared value definition again along the whole chain. So if you find that you cannot ethically source something that can be economically viable for you and for the customer, then I know it's a hard answer, but it shouldn't be done. So we need to stick to those values as we discussed, and then that's where the whole process starts. So we need to set those standards, and if it works with those standards, then yes, it should be done. If it doesn't, then we need to find a different product, a different service offering, and give that to the customers that's economically viable.
And I think
answer the question, Mike?
I think there's an additional part that comes into the mix that might be worth looking at as well. We keep thinking that the way that we do things today are the only ways that we can do it, and I'm not even referring to rescinding on purchase, which obviously is the easiest solution. But we have all kinds of opportunities to be extremely inventive. And of course, if we look at this concept of frugal innovation or constraints-based innovation, where we are able to go ahead and understand the difficulties that are tied to all of these elements and come up with new solutions that actually go ahead and meet these needs, then I would look at this as actually being a challenge to pose to everybody. How do we go ahead and make these things happen? We all know that just because it hasn't been done so far, it doesn't mean it's not possible. The real problem is that people haven't seen the need to go ahead and follow that path. And so I guess the real point I'm trying to raise is that this is an open appel to everybody. How do we go ahead and manage this better? Because there has to be a solution that takes all of the pillars that you're talking about, those three components, that as long as we're able to go ahead and cover those basic tenets of those pillars you're talking about, then we're being sustainable. And so on the one hand, so can we actually go ahead and afford from a personal level to be okay with the damage that is causing somewhere else? That would be the first one that would immediately come to mind. And don't we believe in human ingenuity, and that we're able to actually come up with better solutions than what we've come up with so far? I mean, let's put it this way: we didn't think that we would be able to come up with a vaccine for COVID-19 within the period of time. So this is all doable. Why don't we take on malaria? Sorry, going on to a different point.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. But Mike, this is absolutely one of the critical angles, because what we try to do right now also in supply chains, and that was one of the things that I also touched base on earlier. It's really important to empower the people to do these things, right? So instead of restricting, roles, we need to allow more complex roles and people to use their brain power, instead of thinking, oh, that's all she or he or can do, right? Or the machine can do. So yeah, so think out of the box every single day. What
Mm-hmm.
if you didn't have even that much? What would you
Mm-hmm.
do? Anyway, we have another question.
Yes,
Yes.
right. Speaking of out of the box, I love this question from Raza where she talks about carbon offsets. So, what's your
Ooh.
take on carbon offsets?
Great question. No, for me, that's one of those things that also needs to go. There's no such thing as offsetting each other's carbon footprint the way we designed it. That buy and sell of quotas and etc. that we have at the moment, no, needs to be stopped. For me, that is basically sending the message that as a company, you can close your mind, think about what you're doing, and just place that monkey on someone else's shoulder conveniently. That's transactional and linear thinking. So we are fostering here the wrong behavior, right? So for me, why it needs to change is because it's not fostering the right thinking and the right solutions, if I may put it that way. And also that hard there, right? So we need to deal with our own trash. And then I know it has come up in so many different ways, but yes, we need to deal with our own trash and
Yeah, well, we
do
have a
it.
historical perspective for this. So for those of you who are familiar with history of the Middle Ages, we used to have within the Catholic Church a practice that was called indulgences, and basically
Oh, yes.
within an indulgence meant that you can go ahead and sin as much as you want on a weekend or whatever it may be, whatever the
Yes.
period would be. You could do whatever. Oops, you could do whatever you want, and as long as you have enough money to buy these indulgences, that you are off the hook. For me, this carbon offset is nothing more and nothing less than a modern day indulgence. Want to make sure that we get
Thank
to,
you.
yeah.
Couldn't
I
have
want
studied
to,
better.
well, but it's true. I mean, when you think about it, that's exactly what it is. I like to get to some of the questions because we'll need to go
Sorry,
ahead
yeah,
and
of
come to an
course.
end.
Yeah.
This is tied to medical manufacturing supply chain, sustainability under the pandemic period. What are your thoughts on this one, Zsofia?
Very quickly, basically, the regulatory environment in the medical manufacturing or pharma industry is still inflexible to the new solutions that could provide the same, protection for the medicine that goes into the packaging, for instance. And the way we also manufacture these medicines is also very resource consuming. So that will be an uphill battle. First and foremost because of the regulatory restrictions, but secondly also because of that very inflexible mindset that we currently have in the pharma industry towards what constitutes efficacy and how much resources are needed. So that upstream innovation hasn't taken place for a long time. So for instance, we haven't moved, that's a good example actually that you can use later. Why is that we haven't been able to move from batch production to inline production on many of the medicines, that are small molecule, easy complex, right? Or any other aspects, right? Upstream where the consumption of raw materials is just insane to get, a few of the tablets or vial of vaccine, for instance, which is going to be challenging to rethink from a technological perspective, but it's not impossible to do.
I think part of the problem here is that we have a certain mindset that we can't free ourselves from. And the real
Yes.
problem was tied to the R&D on the one side and the production on the other, because we think that it's always a married pair. And
Yes.
of course, today we have the possibility, due to so many options from a technology perspective, to perform things much more efficiently. And if we're really talking about closed loops and we're talking about managing and getting the waste out, wouldn't it have been a much healthier and productive approach to ensure that the individuals or the companies performing the R&D are not the ones who are necessarily responsible for doing the production? Because you could just do a carpet production and you would have gotten the vaccine out. And of course, don't even look at it from a logistical perspective, because you would have the production being done locally. And technically,
Exactly.
this is all possible. It's just that we need to get past this mindset that we have. So
Correct.
I wonder to a certain degree that this was used as an excuse for us to go back to those ways that we've always done things. It's almost like the old donkey, and you gets tired in the middle of the afternoon and wants to go back to the stall. And it's almost like that. We are like the old donkeys that get tired, and we just go back to the slash and burn approach that we've always done.
Oh yeah.
And so let's make sure that we call this one as it is. So in any case, I'm afraid we're going to need to go ahead and close up here, Zsofia. So perhaps if I can give you an opportunity to share with us some closing words from your perspective.
Yes, and thank you. I think what I would just ask from everyone listening at the moment is, as a professional, again, I know I usually say this, but think about really how you work every day, and how you can also spread, that educational element within and outside of the company, and even to younger people around you, because it's very critical that we get that social, ecological, and economical balance on these three pillars in our supply chains and in our businesses. I talk about supply chain all the time, but this is really a business-wide thing. So I would say, start also frugal innovating every day in your life, and you will get rewarded beyond your expectations. So I can just say that call to action: just start the process yourself, and it will help you on the way, and you will get rewarded.